Hi there, and welcome to Coup English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. Logic and Destiny. The Life of George Boole. The story behind the mind that made thinking into mathematics. Chapter 1. The Boy from Lincoln. The city of Lincoln, in eastern England, was not the kind of place that made the front pages of newspapers in the early 1800s. Its narrow cobbled streets, modest shops, and the towering Lincoln Cathedral had stood for centuries, watching over generations of quiet lives. Among these lives, in a small house on Silver Street, a baby boy was born on November 2nd, 1815. His name was George Boole, a name few would recognize in his own time, but one that would later echo across the halls of science and technology. George's father, John Boole, was a man of gentle habits and endless curiosity, though his profession was that of a shoemaker, and later a cobbler. His real love was for the sciences astronomy, optics, and mechanics. The little shop he ran was often more of a tinkering lab than a business. Inside were not just shoes and tools, but also lenses, glass tubes, old clocks, and books stacked in careful chaos. George's mother, Mary, was practical and orderly, the daughter of a well-regarded tradesman. She kept the family grounded. The Booles were not wealthy, and the idea of raising a family on the income of a part-time shoemaker and full-time dreamer required patience and frugality. George was the first of 4 children. From a young age, he was quiet, serious, and inward-looking. While other boys chased each other through muddy alleys, George often stayed indoors, his nose buried in pages he did not yet fully understand. The Boole household had few luxuries, but it did have books and, more importantly, it had permission to be curious. His father noticed early that George had a special gift. At just 7 years old, George began copying designs from his father's telescope blueprints. By age 8, he was not just reading stories, but trying to understand how words worked, how ideas fit together, how meaning could be shaped like clay. His father, delighted, began teaching him whatever he knew, bits of mathematics, simple geometry, how a telescope worked, and how time could be measured with pendulums. But there was something George wanted even more than gadgets or numbers: language. One day, at age 10, he overheard the local pastor reading a poem by the Roman poet Virgil. George didn't understand the Latin words, but he felt their rhythm and beauty. He asked his father, what was that? John explained, "That's Latin, son, the language of ancient Rome." George became obsessed. Latin, to him, was more than a subject. It was a mystery to solve. Yet the family couldn't afford tutors, so George did the only thing he could. He taught himself. Using an old Latin grammar book, borrowed from a friend of his father, George began decoding the structure of the language. He read the dictionary like it was a novel. He matched English meanings to Latin endings. He would read until late into the night, the dim light from a tallow candle flickering over pages of Virgil, Cicero, and Horace. He made mistakes, of course, but every mistake was fuel. At age 12, George had mastered enough Latin to translate a poem by Horace so skillfully that a local schoolmaster accused him of plagiarism. They simply couldn't believe a boy from a shoemaker's family had done such a thing on his own. But he had. Soon after, George moved on to Greek, then French, and eventually German. He had no language teachers, just books, questions, and fierce determination. He later recalled that in those early years, he felt alone, not lonely, but separate, as if his world of books and ideas was not quite shared by those around him. The streets of Lincoln continued their slow rhythms, blacksmiths clanging metal, carts rolling over stones, women carrying buckets from the pump. But in the Boole home, something extraordinary was forming, a mind learning to think about thinking. His father once said to a friend, "The boy has a mind made for solving puzzles, not just numbers, but truths." That was not entirely an exaggeration. Already, George had begun asking unusual questions, like, if I can understand a sentence in Latin, can I turn that into a rule? Or how does a sentence mean something? These thoughts, abstract and unwelcome in most grammar schools, would eventually grow into the seeds of symbolic logic. But before that, George had to earn a living. The Boole family had no fortune, no titles, and no pathway to university. What George had were books, discipline, and silence. In many ways, his childhood was both lonely and rich, restricted and yet vast. He was not surrounded by professors or scholars, only by the ticking of clocks, the smell of leather, and the slow, silent forming of an original mind. What Lincoln gave George was not fame, but focus. It gave him time to be quiet, to read, to fail in secret, to begin again and again. And above all, it gave him the gift of learning how to teach himself. Before he turned 15, George Boole would walk the same streets every day, sometimes with a book under his arm, sometimes with a question turning over in his head. He looked like any other boy in worn boots and a plain coat. But his eyes often betrayed something different, the look of someone already moving beyond the world he was born into. Little did he or anyone know that in just a few years, this quiet, book-loving boy would be writing papers that would reach the desks of the greatest minds in mathematics. But for now, he was just the boy from Lincoln, watching the sky through his father's telescope, wondering not only how the stars moved, but how the human mind understood anything at all. Chapter 2. The Family Clock Shop and the Love of Learning. If you walked down Silver Street in the early 1820s and passed by the Boole family's shop, you might have noticed something odd. From the outside, it was an ordinary cobbler's shop, leather boots hanging in the window, the smell of glue and polish in the air. But if you stepped inside and looked past the shoes, you'd see shelves cluttered not with merchandise, but with glass lenses, brass parts, and open books on science and astronomy. On the counter, next to unfinished soles and stitching needles, there might be a compass or a handmade sundial. This was no ordinary shoemaker's space. This was John Boole's second world, and George, his eldest son, was its most devoted student. John Boole, though self-taught, had a mind that leaned naturally toward invention. He could repair watches and build optical devices. Even constructing a small telescope using nothing but spare parts and glass, he had ground himself. He was a dreamer, deeply fascinated with the physical world, though unable to make a living from that fascination. His heart was in science, but his hands had to stitch leather. George grew up surrounded by this quiet duality, craft and curiosity, work and wonder. He helped in the shop when needed, but more often, he was off in a corner reading about Euclid or Newton. The clock shop became, in truth, a study room where leather dust settled on open pages of science books, and tools of precision lay side by side with instruments of imagination. The Boole family was not wealthy, not even comfortably poor. They were working class, often unsure whether the month's income would be enough. George's mother, Mary Ann, was proud and practical. She had no time for dreams or theories unless they paid rent. She valued discipline and feared that George's constant reading might turn him into someone unfit for the real world. Still, she loved her son and saw his brightness. She allowed him his late-night studies, his obsession with languages and numbers, so long as he helped his younger siblings and took his responsibilities seriously. The tensions in the house were real. There were times when the family had 2 pawn books just to buy food. John's scientific hobbies brought admiration from neighbors, but not much money. Mary sometimes asked him, gently but firmly, why he didn't focus on the shoemaking. John would smile and return to his telescope. George, in the middle of all this, was learning something few children ever truly master: how to balance the world as it is with the world as it could be. He saw his father's unpaid genius and his mother's silent strength. He understood that dreams didn't pay bills, but they did light fires inside the soul. At the age of 13, George began helping his father with the shop's more technical work, repairing clocks, adjusting tiny gears, polishing lenses. The work required patience, precision, and a certain rhythm, like solving a math puzzle with your hands. It gave George a new kind of respect for order and systems. But outside the shop, the world was beginning to press in. At school, George's teachers respected his discipline, but were puzzled by his ambition. He was the kind of student who didn't just want to learn the lesson, he wanted to rewrite it. He asked why numbers behaved the way they did, why logic followed certain patterns, These weren't the kinds of questions schools had time for. To most boys in Lincoln, education was a temporary chapter before life as an apprentice or tradesman. But for George, learning wasn't a phase. It was a necessity. One winter, a local bookseller named Mr. Diamond offered George a chance to borrow books from his private collection. The offer changed everything. Through this new gateway, George met authors like Laplace, Lagrange, and Descartes, minds far beyond the English school curriculum. He copied entire pages by hand, filling notebooks late into the night, trying to understand the strange, elegant world of advanced mathematics. And still, every morning, he helped open the shop. By 15, George had already passed through what many adults never face: the knowledge that no one was going to carry him forward. There would be no university entrance, no patron, no golden opportunity. If he wanted to become a scholar, he would have to be one on his own. It was then that George made a quiet decision. He would begin teaching, not because he wanted to, but because his family needed the money. At first, he gave lessons to neighborhood children, helping them with grammar and arithmetic. Then, word spread. There's a boy in Lincoln who can teach Latin, and he's cheaper than the schoolmasters. Before long, George was earning a small but steady income as a teenage tutor. And with it came a strange transformation. The student had become the teacher. Looking back, George once described those years as the most challenging of his life. I had to teach in the morning, study in the evening, and repair shoes when time allowed, he wrote. And all the while, I feared I would lose myself in the effort. But he didn't. In fact, the opposite happened. The act of teaching forced George to clarify his thinking, to turn instinct into structure. He began to see that knowledge, like a clock, needed gears that fit. He started to write small essays, mostly for himself, about the nature of reasoning. Why did certain statements follow others? What made an argument valid? Could thought itself be measured? In the ticking silence of the family shop, George Boole began to imagine something no one else had quite seen, that logic could be written down not just in words, but in symbols, like algebra, that the mind could be mapped, like a machine. But that idea was still far off. For now, George was a teenager with heavy eyes, ink-stained fingers, and a pile of students waiting for lessons. He kept teaching, he kept reading, and every now and then, when the shop was empty, he would sit. Chapter 3. Latin before breakfast, Greek before tea. The Boole household woke early. It had to. The shop opened at sunrise, and every hand was needed. While his mother prepared breakfast and his father sorted tools, George would already be at the table, a grammar book open, a candle barely holding on against the morning dark. This was the quiet hour, the one time of day no one asked anything of him. And in that hour, before breakfast, he studied Latin, not just nouns and verbs, but poetry, speeches, philosophy. He copied lines from Virgil and Cicero into worn notebooks, not only translating but analyzing, asking why certain words came before others, how sentence structures affected meaning, what made one phrase noble and another forgettable. Language, for George, was not just communication, it was logic dressed in beauty. By the time the rest of the family was ready for the day, George had already completed a morning's work of reading and writing in a language most adults around him could not understand. Later in the afternoon, when tutoring jobs or shoe repairs allowed, he would turn to Greek. Greek before tea, he called it a rhythm that gave his day shape, even if it made him seem odd to others. Greek, unlike Latin, was less forgiving. Its syntax was more fluid, its alphabet unfamiliar, its roots deep in mythology and mathematics. But that only drew George in further. The Boole family could not afford tutors. Instead, George relied on borrowed books, sometimes missing pages, their spines cracked and corners stained by years of use. He begged old teachers for notes, convinced a local printer to lend him damaged copies, and once spent an entire week repairing a man's boots just to borrow a French grammar for 1 month. It wasn't just classical languages that fascinated him. Soon, George added French and German to his studies. French brought him closer to the world of Enlightenment thinkers, Rousseau, Pascal, Voltaire, German opened doors to the cutting-edge mathematics of Gauss and Leibniz. Language was becoming a bridge, a way for George to move beyond the narrow walls of Lincoln into conversations with the greatest minds in Europe across time and space. Each new tongue added another set of tools to his intellectual toolbox. He wasn't simply learning vocabulary, he was learning how different cultures thought. More than once, people in Lincoln wondered why George bothered. "You're not going to become a professor," one local man scoffed. "What's the use of Greek to a cobbler's son?" But George didn't study to become something. He studied because the very act of learning gave him breath. One evening, George sat with a friend's copy of Homer's Iliad, trying to translate a section about honor and fate. He became frustrated with one line, a compound verb whose meaning changed based on the mood of the surrounding sentence. After hours of trying to find the right English phrasing, George paused. It wasn't just the word that was hard, it was the idea behind it. Greek had ways of expressing possibility and logic that English lacked, and that realization stuck with him. Perhaps, he wrote in a notebook, grammar is a kind of code, and thought itself is the key. He was beginning to see something deeper beneath language, beneath Latin, Greek, French, or German. There was structure. There were rules, patterns, relationships. There was logic. This was no small idea. It planted in George the suspicion that maybe thought could be organized, even calculated. If language could be diagrammed, then maybe ideas could too. Maybe the human mind followed rules the same way grammar did. Maybe the soul had syntax. These were not conclusions yet, just questions. But they were the kind of questions that stay, silently guiding future discoveries. Meanwhile, the pace of his life did not slow. He was now teaching 6 days a week, sometimes walking miles between students' homes, carrying books under his coat to protect them from rain. At night, too tired to read by candlelight, he would lie in bed replaying translations in his mind, mouthing German phrases or Latin declensions, whispering ideas to the darkness. Despite his fatigue, his hunger grew. George began keeping multiple notebooks, one for math, one for languages, one for logic. He rarely showed them to anyone. These were private maps of his mind, filled with questions he didn't know how to answer yet. His friends saw him as odd, intense, even a bit detached. But his younger siblings saw something else, a brother who never stopped asking questions, who would pause a lesson to explain why something was interesting, not just correct. To them, he was not just smart, he was kind. He shared books, helped them with arithmetic, told them stories of Greek heroes and Roman philosophers as they fell asleep. One winter morning, after a long night of translating, George came down to breakfast, holding a page in his hand. "I think I finally got it," he told his father. It was a French sentence with multiple negatives, a structure that had confused him for weeks. Now, not only had he translated it, he had diagrammed its logical form. John Boole, impressed, said quietly, "Your mind goes where few can follow." But George didn't want to be followed. Not yet. He still felt like he was building something layer by layer, day by day, and each new language was another brick in that invisible structure. In time, his language skills would allow him to read mathematical papers no Englishman had yet translated, to communicate with continental scholars, and to articulate ideas in symbolic language that transcended national borders. But at this point, George Boole was still just a young man with ink-stained fingers and a hunger that never let go. Every morning, Latin before breakfast. Every evening, Greek before tea. Chapter 4. A Teacher Before 20. When George Boole turned 16, most young men in Lincoln were thinking about apprenticeships, trade, or joining their father's professions. George was thinking about opening a school. It wasn't a dream born from ambition. It was born from necessity. His father's business was struggling. Science, for all its wonder, hadn't put food on the table. George had become the family's most reliable source of income through tutoring. Every week, more families came to him, asking if he could teach their sons Latin, arithmetic, or English composition. And so, reluctantly, then gradually with purpose, he realized perhaps it was time to take on the full responsibility of teaching, not just students, but running a school of his own. He was barely 17. At first, it was just a small classroom above a draper's shop on Free School Lane. The room had cracked windows, squeaky floorboards, and no heating in winter. But George didn't care. He spent days arranging chairs, writing lesson plans, copying grammar tables by hand for students who couldn't afford books. He named it simply Boole's School. His students were boys aged 8 to 14. Some were curious. Others were sent by their parents as a form of discipline. George, young as he was, had to learn how to control a room, how to discipline fairly, and how to inspire attention from students who were only half listening. Many of them were older than he was in size, and some came from wealthier homes, but none of them had his depth of knowledge nor his passion. He was serious, formal, almost overly strict in the beginning. He insisted on punctuality, full participation, and respect. He wore his best coat every day, even when it was threadbare. He believed that education was a kind of sacred labor, and he refused to treat it as anything less than life-changing. At night, after lessons, George would clean the classroom, revise his lessons, and read advanced mathematical texts by candlelight. He had discovered something new: calculus. The work of Newton and Leibniz fascinated him, but it was hard going. He had no tutor, no university lecture, only the books he had managed to borrow, sometimes in French or German, and his own mind to struggle through the equations. Often, he would get stuck on a problem for days, even weeks. He would scribble solutions in the margins of his school records on scrap paper between lesson notes. Sometimes, he would pause in the middle of teaching grammar to write down a sudden mathematical idea, then return to the blackboard as if nothing had happened. The parents of his students were impressed. "How old is he again?" they would whisper. "And he teaches Latin and algebra." Word spread. More students came. A second classroom was added. Soon, George was hiring a helper, someone older than he was, to assist with the younger children. But the success came with a cost. George rarely rested. He had no formal schooling of his own, no holidays, no community of fellow thinkers. His work was solitary. He missed out on the social life that most young men enjoy. At dances and gatherings, he felt awkward and distant, unsure what to say. He knew how to explain the laws of logic, but had never learned how to hold a conversation about trivial things. People admired him, but few understood him. Still, he pressed on. By the time he was 19, he was reading Laplace's work on probability and Lagrange's treatises on analytical mechanics, both in French. He also began experimenting with writing his own mathematical essays, mostly for himself, but with an increasing sense of purpose. He had an idea, still unformed, that mathematics could express things beyond numbers, ideas, relationships, even reasoning itself. But for now, there were students to teach. One of them, a quiet boy named James, stayed after class one day and asked George, "Why do you teach so much?" George looked at him, surprised by the question. He thought for a moment, then replied, "Because I have no other way to learn." It was a strange answer, but it was true. Teaching had become George's way of learning. Every subject he taught forced him to understand it more deeply. Every mistake a student made showed him a new way of explaining, a new connection between ideas. In guiding others, he was guiding himself. There were moments of joy, like when a student finally grasped a hard concept, or when George found an elegant solution to a difficult equation. But there were also moments of exhaustion, when he doubted whether any of it was leading anywhere. After all, he was still just a schoolmaster in Lincoln. He had no title, no degree, no published work. And yet, every day, he grew more certain that his mind was building something powerful and invisible, something that had to do with how thought itself worked. One evening, after a long day of teaching and solving equations, George stood at the window of his schoolroom and looked out at the quiet street below. The candles inside flickered in the glass, and for a moment he saw his reflection, a young man with tired eyes, ink-stained cuffs, and a fire behind his gaze. He wasn't there by chance. He had chosen this life, or rather, he had chosen to keep choosing, to learn, to teach, to think, no matter how invisible the path. In a town that had little space for philosophers, George Boole was becoming one, not by title, by practice. Chapter 5: Equations and Epiphanies. The schoolroom was quiet. The students had gone home. A cold wind whistled under the door, and the last rays of winter light stretched across the wooden floor. George Boole sat alone at his desk, staring at a page covered in unfamiliar symbols. It was a book on differential equations written in French. He had borrowed it from the dusty back shelf of a local bookseller who didn't know its value. George, however, knew exactly what he was holding. These were the tools of the modern mathematician, the language of curves, rates of change, and invisible forces. It was the mathematics that explained the stars and the tides. He could barely afford bread, but now he was feeding a deeper hunger. As he worked through each line, translating as he went, he felt the strange exhilaration of solving something no teacher had explained. He was alone, no tutors, no classroom, no one to correct him, but that meant he was free to follow ideas wherever they lead. One evening, while studying a problem in mechanics, George paused. It wasn't that the math was wrong, it was that something didn't feel complete. The equations described how things moved, but not why. The symbols danced beautifully, but they lacked a soul, and that's when it struck him. What if mathematics could be used to describe thought itself? That idea did not come with thunder. It came with silence, the kind that only comes when something important has quietly changed inside you. The notion had been forming for years, even if he hadn't named it. As he taught Latin grammar and worked with logical argument forms in composition exercises, he had begun to see that reasoning followed patterns, much like equations. Arguments had variables. Conclusions depended on structure. Truth, perhaps, could be made measurable. What if, instead of writing logic in sentences, he wrote it in symbols? What if you could take a syllogism, like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, and express it with algebra? Could mortal be m, and Socrates be s? Could truth be 1, and falsehood 0? It was a radical thought. Logic had always belonged to philosophers, cloaked in language and ambiguity. But George had a different vision, one where logic was mathematics in disguise. He scribbled notes furiously, then paused, then rewrote everything again. It wasn't just about solving one problem. It was about inventing a new kind of mathematics, a way to describe mental operations with the precision of calculus. But how do you explain this to anyone? George kept these thoughts mostly to himself. He still ran the school during the day, still tutored students in the evenings. His life remained humble, ordinary to any passerby. But in secret, he was building a new language, not just a language of numbers, but a language of reasoning. He began writing more seriously, drafting essays, structuring ideas. His first real mathematical paper on certain theorems in the theory of linear transformations would not appear for a few more years, but the seeds were already in the ground. He practiced his proofs like music, returning to them again and again until they felt inevitable. He also started to notice something else: beauty in structure. Equations weren't just tools, they were expressions of harmony. The way a formula unfolded could feel like a poem. A balanced identity could give the same satisfaction as a perfectly written sentence. To George, math and language were no longer separate. They were mirror images, each offering insight into the human mind. One evening, as he walked home through the foggy streets of Lincoln, he heard a church bell echoing in the distance. He thought of sound waves and harmonics, how motion created form. He thought of logic gates, though the term hadn't been coined yet, and how the mind could be modeled like a system. He was 21. No university degree, no formal training, no mentor guiding him, but his mind had begun to leap beyond the limits of his town and time. One Sunday morning, while resting from a week of teaching, George returned to a notebook he'd set aside. In it were half-finished thoughts on symbols representing logical classes. He rewrote them from scratch. This time, he let himself be bold. He let and/or and not become operations. He drew diagrams, intersections, exclusions, binary representations. His equations didn't solve physical problems. They revealed mental structures. To anyone else, The pages might have seemed confusing, but to George, they were the beginning of a new geometry, not of shapes, but of thought itself. He didn't call it Boolean algebra yet. That name would come later from others. For now, it was simply the work of a man who believed that truth could be written, not only with words, but with numbers. Late one night, he closed the notebook, hands ink-stained and tired. He whispered to himself, this might be something. This might be real. He just didn't know how real yet. Chapter 6. The First Proofs, the First Recognition. By the time George Boole reached his early 20s, he had already spent more years teaching than most university graduates. His days remained filled with the noise and energy of the schoolroom, but his nights belonged to silence and to mathematics. Stacks of notebooks covered his desk, filled with theorems, diagrams, and speculative equations. At times, the ink faded where he had pressed too lightly. Other pages were almost torn from being rewritten too many times. For years, these pages were his private world, hidden from public view. He was a teacher by profession, but in his heart, he was now something else, a mathematician. Still, a question lingered. How does a young man without connections, without credentials, and without a formal education enter the world of professional mathematics? He found an answer in the pages of the Cambridge Mathematical Journal. It was a modest publication, recently established, and unlike the more prestigious journals of the time, it welcomed contributions from outsiders, especially those with fresh ideas. George read it with growing fascination. The proofs, the problems, the style of argumentation, all of it was familiar to him, though he had never been taught how to write a formal paper. He studied the format carefully, reverse engineering each article until he felt he understood what was expected. Then, with a mix of excitement and dread, he prepared his first submission. Researches on the theory of analytical transformations, with a special application to the reduction of the general equation of the second order. The title alone revealed the ambition. He sent the manuscript in, fully expecting rejection. After all, who was he? Just a schoolteacher from Lincoln, with no degree, no academic position, and no one to speak on his behalf. But weeks later, a letter arrived. The article had been accepted. Not only accepted, it had impressed the editors. George held the letter in his hands, stunned. This wasn't a dream. His ideas were now in print, alongside scholars from Cambridge and other respected institutions. For the first time, someone beyond his small world had acknowledged the value of his mind. The recognition did more than lift his spirits. It changed how he saw himself. Encouraged, he wrote again and again. His next paper, on a general method in analysis, introduced new symbolic techniques that could simplify complex calculations in differential equations. His method was elegant, systematic, and most importantly, original. These were not repetitions of others' work. Boole was doing something new. Word of the young schoolmaster mathematician began to spread quietly. Among mathematicians in England and later on the continent, his name was no longer unfamiliar. Though he remained far from the lecture halls of Oxford or the grandeur of London salons, Boole was being taken seriously. Still, his daily life remained the same. Each morning, he unlocked the doors of his school. He taught arithmetic to small boys and scolded them for poor handwriting. In the evenings, he read the latest issue of the Mathematical Journal, his eyes scanning for errors or inspiration. Some nights, he walked home through the rain with only a candle in his pocket and a head full of theorems. His clothes were worn and his shoes leaked, but he never let these things interrupt his concentration. He was building something far greater than a career. He was building a language of truth. And yet, recognition brought its own burdens. For the first time, George felt the pressure to prove himself, not just in theory, but in reputation. The world he had stepped into was filled with brilliant minds. Cauchy, Gauss, De Morgan, men whose names would echo through history. Could a self-taught schoolmaster from Lincoln truly stand among them? To answer that question, he knew he had to go further. His next project would be bolder than anything he had attempted. He wanted to create a unified system, a way to capture the logic of the mind using mathematics. He had experimented with it before, scribbled notes in private, but now he felt a new urgency. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding his boldest ideas. Perhaps the world was ready, or perhaps not. But he had to try. In one letter to a fellow mathematician, he wrote humbly, "I do not profess to be a philosopher. I am only a mathematician." But in truth, what he was building was philosophy, only written in the alphabet of algebra. As his publications increased, so did the letters. One day, a message arrived from Augustus de Morgan, the respected logician and professor in London. De Morgan had read Boole's work with interest and saw in him a rare clarity of thought. Their correspondence soon became a long and respectful exchange, two minds meeting across distance, speaking through equations and formal arguments. De Morgan didn't care that Boole lacked a university degree. He saw what mattered: precision, creativity, and depth. This friendship, intellectual and encouraging, would shape Boole's confidence in the years to come. It also confirmed something he had long suspected but never dared to believe. He didn't need to be at the university to contribute to its thinking. He was already doing that. Back in Lincoln, the school continued. Bills needed to be paid, and students needed teaching. But Boole's mind had taken flight. He began working on what would become the cornerstone of his legacy, a system where logic and algebra would merge. The work would take years, but now, for the first time, he knew he had the right to try, not because someone had given him permission, but because he had proven it, one theorem at a time. Chapter 7. The Language of Thought. In the quiet hours between dusk and midnight, George Boole sat at his desk, the same wooden one he had used for years. Around him were scattered pages of mathematical notation, logical symbols, and abstract diagrams. His mind was no longer concerned with the physical world alone. He was now focused on something far more elusive, the architecture of reasoning itself. From his earliest days teaching grammar and composition, Boole had seen how language was governed by patterns. Now, he believed that human thought followed patterns too, not rhetorical, but logical. If these patterns could be captured with clarity, if they could be written like equations, then reasoning itself could become a form of calculation. This was not an easy idea to explain. At the time, logic was still the domain of philosophy, expressed in prose, often abstract and circular. But Boole was not content with words alone. He wanted a system structured, symbolic, and precise. He believed that logic could become a branch of mathematics. His notebooks from this period show his developing ideas. He began by assigning values to basic logical statements. True as 1, false as 0. Simple enough. But then came the real insight. Just as numbers could be added or multiplied, so could logical truths. He experimented with operations. What happened if you added two truths, or multiplied a truth with a falsehood? He created a new kind of algebra, one in which symbols stood not for quantities, but for concepts. He called them classes or terms and manipulated them, using algebraic rules. For example, let X represent the class of all people, and Y the class of all mortals. In Boole's system, the statement "all people are mortal" could be written and solved like an equation. It was a revolutionary idea. He had begun to algebraize logic. At first, the concepts seemed strange, even unnatural, but Boole pushed forward. With each page, he refined the system. He examined propositions, their combinations, and their implications. Where Aristotle had used syllogisms, Boole now used equations. Where philosophers had used language, Boole now used variables. In 1847, he decided it was time to publish. The result was a small but bold book titled The Mathematical Analysis of Logic, printed privately. It was modest in appearance, but its contents were anything but. Inside, Boole laid out the foundations of a symbolic logic. He showed how basic reasoning could be expressed with clarity and rigor. The response from the academic world was mixed at first. Some scholars were puzzled. What was this schoolmaster from Lincoln attempting to do, reshaping centuries of philosophical tradition with algebra? Others, however, were intrigued. They recognized a new path opening before them, one that merged disciplines previously thought to be separate. One of the earliest and most important responses came from Augustus de Morgan, Boole's friend and correspondent. De Morgan praised the originality of Boole's work, calling it a new language for logic. Though he offered critiques and questions, he also provided Boole with what he most needed: serious engagement. To Boole, this was more valuable than applause. Yet, outside of academic circles, few understood the weight of what had occurred. Boole continued to teach, to walk the same quiet streets, to live modestly. But within him, something had changed. He was no longer a man attempting to understand mathematics. He had created something of his own, a mathematics of meaning. Still, the work was far from complete. The mathematical analysis of logic was just the beginning. Boole knew his system had inconsistencies, and some of his own rules didn't yet generalize well. He wasn't content with approximation. He wanted to refine, to build a lasting structure. So he returned to his notebooks. He began working on a larger and more rigorous treatment. This time, he would not only demonstrate how logic could be expressed algebraically, he would show how such a system could be used to deduce truths mechanically, without human intuition. If successful, this would be a kind of intellectual revolution. By now, George was 32. He had never attended a university, but the universities had begun to take notice of him. In fact, whispers of a possible professorship were circulating. But Boole was not thinking about titles. He was thinking about symbols and how they could model thought. He was trying to build a bridge from the world of mind to the world of mathematics. And slowly, brick by brick, that bridge was beginning to take shape. Chapter 8. A Logical World, a Personal Life. By the early 1850s, George Boole was no longer just a name tucked into the back pages of a mathematical journal. He had earned recognition, not through charm or connections, but through the sheer clarity and originality of his work. In 1849, he was offered what would have once seemed impossible: the first professorship of mathematics at Queen's College, Cork, in Ireland. He was 34 years old, and for the first time in his life, his work as a mathematician was no longer a private pursuit carried out after hours. It was his official profession. The move to Ireland was not easy. Cork was unfamiliar, and Boole, naturally quiet and introspective, found the social world of a college professor both strange and demanding. The Irish climate was damp, and the college itself, only recently established, still lacked many of the resources of older institutions. But Boole did not complain. He was grateful for the opportunity to live by his thoughts. In the classroom, he was precise but gentle. Students admired his patience and humility. He did not shout or scold. When a student made an error, Boole would pause, tilt his head slightly, and then rephrase the problem so that the answer became clear. He believed deeply in the power of clarity, both in mathematics and in teaching. Outside the classroom, his ideas grew more ambitious. He was now writing what he considered his life's greatest work, an investigation of the laws of thought, on which are founded the mathematical theories of logic and probabilities. It was not a simple book. Even the title was dense, but its aim was grand, to formalize the very processes of the human mind. Where his earlier work had suggested that logic could be expressed in algebraic terms, this book would attempt to show why it must be so. He would describe not just logical operations, but how uncertainty, belief, and probability could be handled within the same symbolic framework. The writing process was slow and meticulous. Boole revised constantly, cutting pages, reordering arguments, reworking symbols. He refused to rush the process. This was more than a book. It was a structure he hoped would endure long after his own life. During these years, something else changed. Boole met Mary Everest. She was the niece of Sir George Everest, the same Everest whose name would later be given to the world's tallest mountain. Mary had been raised in a well-educated, curious household. She was young, bright, and spirited. When she came to Cork to study under Boole's supervision, it was not long before their intellectual conversations became something deeper. Their marriage in 1855 surprised some. Boole was quiet, serious, and over a decade older. Mary was lively and inquisitive. but their relationship was deeply affectionate and intellectually balanced. They were equals of the mind, and their conversations often stretched late into the night. Mary shared his fascination with learning, and she respected the quiet discipline that drove his work. Together, they would eventually have 5 daughters, several of whom would grow into brilliant thinkers themselves. Their home was filled with books, music, conversation, and most of all, respect for knowledge. Boole, despite his rising academic profile, remained humble. He did not chase fame or attend fashionable salons. He spent most of his time either teaching, writing, or with his family. He preferred long walks in the countryside to public dinners, and he never forgot the weight of responsibility that came with knowledge. At Queen's College, his reputation continued to grow. He expanded his lectures beyond pure mathematics to include logic, philosophy, and even psychology. He saw all knowledge as connected, all human faculties as part of a great unity. His view was deeply optimistic that the mind, through discipline and clarity, could reach toward truth. In 1854, his masterwork was finally published, an investigation of the laws of thought. The reception was respectful, if cautious. The mathematical community appreciated its innovation, though some found it difficult. Philosophers were intrigued, but unsure. No one doubted Boole's genius, but many were uncertain how to categorize this work. Was it mathematics, philosophy, logic, psychology? In truth, it was all of these. Boole had done what few dared to attempt. He had created a system that bridged disciplines and offered a new foundation for understanding thought. He had given the world Boolean algebra, though it would not be called that until long after his death. Despite the weight of such accomplishments, Boole remained rooted in the quiet rhythms of daily life. He walked to the college with a small umbrella and a folded notebook in his coat pocket. He taught with patience, wrote with care, and returned home each evening to the voices of his daughters and the warm presence of Mary. And in all of this, amid chalk, ink, and raindrops, he continued building the logical world that would one day become the bedrock of computers, circuits, and digital life. But Boole didn't know that. He wasn't working for posterity. He was working because he believed that truth could be made visible, and that the mind, when given structure, could reach further than imagination alone. The next chapters of his life would bring new challenges, deeper recognition, and the quiet final notes of a life lived in pursuit of clarity. Chapter 9: The Final Years and the Seeds of Legacy. In the years following the publication of an investigation of the laws of thought, George Boole entered a new phase of life. He was now not just a thinker or teacher, but a recognized scholar, invited to conferences, consulted by peers, and respected by an ever-growing intellectual community across Europe. Yet he remained, as always, modest in his habits and humble in his views. At Queen's College, Cork, his lectures attracted students not only because of the subject matter, but because of his manner. There was no arrogance in his teaching. He guided his students like a careful craftsman, showing them not only how to solve problems, but how to think clearly. He encouraged questions, respected uncertainty, and made even the most abstract topics feel accessible. His home life was rich and deeply personal. Mary, his wife, had become his closest companion in both intellectual and domestic matters. Their family expanded steadily. Their daughters grew up in a house where books lined every wall and conversations flowed freely between topics like mathematics, history, poetry, and the natural world. Boole never drew strict lines between fields. He believed in the unity of knowledge, that logic and language, numbers and nature were all expressions of the same underlying truths. He spoke often of this idea with Mary and with a few trusted colleagues, and he continued to write not just technical treatises, but also essays on the philosophy of mathematics and the broader implications of reason. It was during this time that his work began to influence other thinkers in more visible ways. Scholars in Britain, Germany, and France began citing his logic in their own research. Philosophers took interest in the mathematical precision of his arguments. Mathematicians explored how his symbolic language could be adapted beyond logic into probability, set theory, and even electrical theory. Boole himself remained cautious. He knew that his system was not yet fully integrated into the mainstream. He saw its beauty and its potential, but he also recognized its imperfections. He believed it would take future generations to develop it further, to refine its form, expand its reach, and discover applications he himself could not imagine. Still, honors began to arrive. He was awarded honorary degrees. His work was reviewed in international journals. He was invited to give talks in major cities, though he rarely accepted these invitations. Preferring the quiet rhythm of Cork, he appreciated the recognition, not for his own sake, but because it meant that the ideas were taking root. During these final productive years, Boole also turned increasingly toward probability. He began to ask, if logic governed certainty, could it also be extended to uncertainty? If so, perhaps probability wasn't just a measure of likelihood, it was a logical statement about incomplete knowledge. He saw deep beauty in this idea that both certainty and uncertainty could be handled by a single, coherent system. He published several papers on the subject, showing how probability laws could be derived using his logical algebra. It was yet another step in a lifelong journey to describe thought in mathematical terms. Despite his growing influence, Boole's daily life remained simple. He still walked to lectures in his worn coat. He still carried a notebook in his pocket. He still rose early, worked late, and spent long evenings reading or in quiet conversation with Mary. And though he never sought the spotlight, students from all over Ireland came to study under him. They left his classes not only better mathematicians, but better thinkers. By 1864, Boole was 50 years old. To his colleagues, he seemed in his prime. His work was gaining momentum. His family was healthy. His students respected him, and his mind was as sharp and curious as ever. But there was a kind of urgency in him now. He had more to write, more to understand. He spoke often of starting a new book, one that would bring together his thoughts on probability, logic, and language in a more unified way. He felt time pressing, though he never said so aloud. That autumn, as the days grew colder and Cork's grey skies thickened with rain, Boole continued his work undeterred. He lectured regularly, he met with students, he drafted new papers, and he remained, in every way, the same quiet, dedicated man he had always been. He could not know that the days ahead would bring an unexpected turn, but his work, his clear, calm, persistent shaping of ideas, was already planting seeds that would grow far beyond his lifetime. Chapter 10. A Mind Beyond Its Time. It began with rain, a cold, relentless downpour that swept across the streets of Cork in the winter of 1864. George Boole, ever committed, walked to Queen's College in the storm, determined to deliver his lecture despite the weather. His coat was soaked, his boots heavy with water, but he stood before his students and taught, as always, with quiet clarity. Not long after, he fell ill. What at first seemed like a common chill soon worsened. Fever set in, his breathing grew shallow, and within days, it became clear this was more than a seasonal sickness. Boole had developed a severe lung infection, possibly pneumonia. Medical understanding at the time was limited, and though Mary did all she could, keeping him warm, offering teas, calling on doctors, his condition did not improve. He remained in bed, drifting in and out of consciousness. Even in those final days, his mind did not rest. He would sometimes whisper fragments of logic, questions of probability, half-finished thoughts that trailed off into silence. Mary stayed by his side, holding his hand, speaking softly, encouraging him to rest. On December 8, 1864, George Boole passed away. He was just 49 years old. The academic community mourned quietly. A few journals printed respectful tributes. His colleagues spoke of his generosity, his originality, his remarkable humility. In Cork, students remembered him not as a distant scholar, but as a patient teacher who had changed the way they saw the world. But for many, Boole's death passed almost unnoticed. His greatest works were still too advanced. his ideas not yet fully understood. He had written of logic in algebraic symbols and spoken of probability as structured reasoning concepts that, at the time, lived only in the margins of philosophy and mathematics. Yet something extraordinary was already beginning. In the decades that followed, Boole's laws of thought began to find their place not in dusty philosophy books, but in emerging fields of science and engineering. Mathematicians revisited his symbolic logic and began to see its potential. Among them was a young American electrical engineer named Claude Shannon, who, in the 1930s, would make a groundbreaking discovery. Shannon showed that Boole's system, his symbolic binary logic, could be used to model electrical circuits. With 1 and 0, true and false, on and off, Boole's algebra became the foundation of the digital world. Every computer, every smartphone, every line of binary code owes its structure to the quiet thoughts of George Boole. Suddenly, a mind that had once seemed ahead of its time became exactly of its time and beyond. Boole did not live to see this transformation. He never imagined his ideas would power machines, guide satellites, encrypt data, or form the architecture of the internet. He was trying only to understand how we reason, how truth moves from premise to conclusion, how thought can be shaped by rules. And yet, in doing so, he helped create the world we now inhabit. His influence extended not only through machines, but through people. His wife Mary, after his death, became a respected writer and educator in her own right. She published works on mathematics and psychology, advocating for education that respected intuition as well as logic. Their daughters went on to become scientists, writers, and thinkers, each carrying forward a piece of their father's legacy. Even today, in computer science classrooms and engineering labs, students encounter Boole's work without always knowing the man behind it. His name lives on in Boolean logic, in the gates of circuits, in search engines that filter results by true or false. But behind that technical term was a man who once walked to class in the rain, who taught poor children in a one-room school, who wrote by candlelight, and who believed, quietly and completely, that thought could be made visible. He never craved fame. He never worked for recognition. He simply followed ideas wherever they led. And in doing so, George Boole built a bridge between mathematics and meaning, between 19th century logic and 21st century life. A bridge that continues to carry us forward, one equation, one thought, one bit at a time. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.